When we talk about the possibility of a third world war, we're not beginning with missiles, armies, or explosions. We're beginning with tension. Because every major conflict in human history has first existed as a shift in atmosphere, a change in tone, a quiet hardening of positions. And what we are witnessing today is not a sudden crisis, but a gradual and deeply concerning buildup of global strain. Nations are speaking to each other differently now. There is less patience, less willingness to listen, and far more urgency to assert dominance. Where diplomacy once aimed to build bridges, it is increasingly being used to draw lines. And those lines are not just political, they are psychological. They represent fear, mistrust, and a growing belief that cooperation is no longer enough to secure national interests. You see, tension between nations doesn't just come from disagreement, it comes from perception. When one country begins to interpret another's actions as threatening, even defensive measures can be seen as aggression. And once that lens is in place, everything becomes amplified. A military exercise becomes a warning, an alliance becomes a provocation. A negotiation becomes a test of power rather than a search for peace. This is where the real danger lies, not in the existence of conflict, but in the erosion of trust. Because trust is the invisible currency of global stability. When it weakens, nations begin to prepare for the worst, even when the worst has not yet arrived. And preparation, in this context, often means escalation. We are seeing an increase in military spending across the world, not just by one or two countries, but across entire regions. Governments are investing heavily in defense systems, expanding their capabilities and strengthening alliances. Now, on the surface, this can be framed as protection, and to some extent it is. But there is a deeper dynamic at play. When one nation builds, another feels compelled to match it. And when that cycle continues unchecked, it creates a feedback loop of fear and readiness. This is not new. History has shown us this pattern before. But what makes this moment different is the speed and scale at which these dynamics are unfolding. Information travels instantly, decisions are made rapidly, and reactions are often driven more by pressure than by reflection. In such an environment, the margin for error becomes dangerously thin. There is also a shift in how power itself is being defined. It is no longer just about territory or resources. It's about influence, control of narratives, and strategic positioning. Nations are not only competing on the battlefield, but in cyberspace, in economic systems, and in global perception. This broadens the scope of conflict and makes it more complex, more unpredictable. And let's be honest, when complexity increases, clarity decreases. It becomes harder to distinguish between defense and aggression, between precaution and provocation. And in that uncertainty, decisions can be made that carry consequences far beyond their original intent. But perhaps the most critical aspect of rising global tensions is not what's happening between governments. It's what's happening within them and within us. Because nations are led by people, and people are influenced by emotion as much as by logic. Fear, pride, insecurity, ambition, these are powerful forces. And when they are embedded in leadership, they shape policy, strategy, and ultimately the direction of entire Kfekn. So the question we must ask ourselves is not simply, are tensions rising? The evidence clearly suggests they are. The deeper question is, how are we responding to those tensions? Are we feeding them with suspicion and silence, or are we confronting them with dialogue and understanding? Because tension by itself is not destiny. It is a signal, a warning, an opportunity to course correct before escalation becomes inevitable. And this is where responsibility comes into play, not just for leaders, but for societies as a whole. Awareness matters. Engagement matters. The willingness to question narratives, to seek truth, and to advocate for diplomacy over division. These are not passive acts. They are essential contributions to global stability. We cannot control every decision made on the world stage, but we can influence the environment in which those decisions are made. And that begins with recognizing that the path to conflict is often paved long before the first shot is fired. So as we move forward in this conversation, understand this. Wars do not begin with action. They begin with tension left unaddressed. And if we fail to confront that tension now, we may one day be forced to confront its consequences. And as these tensions continue to rise, we are no longer dealing with the kind of warfare the world once understood. The battlefield has changed. The rules have changed. Even the definition of war itself is evolving in ways that are both subtle and deeply unsettling. There was a time when conflict was visible. You could see it. Troops crossing borders, tanks rolling in, planes overhead. It had a beginning, a middle, and an end that people could point to. But today, conflict doesn't always announce itself. It operates in silence, in code, in systems that most people never see but depend on every single day. We are now living in an era where a nation can be disrupted without a single soldier stepping onto foreign soil. Cyber warfare has made it possible to target power grids, financial systems, communication networks, everything that keeps a society functioning. And what makes this so dangerous is not just the damage it can cause, but the ambiguity it creates. You don't always know who is responsible. You don't always know when an attack has truly begun. And when uncertainty becomes part of warfare, it changes how decisions are made. Leaders are forced to act quickly, often without complete information. And in that kind of pressure, the risk of miscalculation increases. A response meant to defend can be interpreted as retaliation. And just like that, escalation begins, not because it was intended, but because it was misunderstood. Then there is the rise of artificial intelligence in military strategy. Now, think about that for a moment. We are creating systems that can analyze threats, make decisions, and potentially act faster than any human ever could. On one hand, this offers efficiency, precision, the ability to reduce human error. But on the other hand, it raises a profound question. What happens when the speed of decision-making outpaces the wisdom behind it? Because wisdom takes time. It requires reflection, context, and an understanding of consequences. But machines operate on logic, on patterns, on data. And while that can be incredibly powerful, it is not inherently moral. It does not feel the weight of human cost. It does not hesitate in the face of irreversible outcomes. So now we find ourselves in a position where the tools of war are becoming faster, smarter, and more autonomous, while the space for human judgment is becoming smaller. And that imbalance should concern us, not because technology is inherently dangerous, but because of how it can be used when guided by fear, competition, or the desire for control. And we cannot talk about modern warfare without addressing the shadow that has existed for decades, the presence of nuclear weapons. These are not new, but their relevance has not diminished. In fact, in a world of rising tensions and rapid technological advancement, the stakes they represent are even higher. Nuclear weapons are not just instruments of war. They are symbols of ultimate consequence. Their existence changes the psychology of conflict. It creates a constant awareness that any major escalation carries the potential for devastation on a scale that is almost impossible to comprehend. And yet, despite that awareness, the systems that govern these weapons are still influenced by human decisions, by political agendas, by moments of crisis. That is a reality we cannot ignore, because the more complex and pressured the global environment becomes, the more fragile those decision-making moments can be. What ties all of this together, cyber capabilities, artificial intelligence, nuclear arsenals, is not just their power, but their speed. Conflict can now escalate in minutes, not months. Reactions can outpace reasoning, and once certain thresholds are crossed, there may be no opportunity to step back. This is the paradox of modern warfare. We have developed technologies that are meant to secure us, to protect us, to give us an advantage. But in doing so, we have also created conditions where a single misstep can have consequences that ripple across the entire world. So the question becomes, are we evolving our sense of responsibility at the same pace as our capabilities? Because having the power to act does not always mean we should act. And having the ability to respond instantly does not mean we understand the full impact of that response. This is not just a technological issue, it is a human one. It challenges our discipline, our restraint, and our ability to think beyond immediate gain. It forces us to confront a deeper truth, that progress without wisdom is not progress at all. And if we continue to advance our tools of conflict without equally advancing our capacity for understanding, then we are not reducing the risk of war, we are accelerating it. Because in this new era, the greatest threat is not just the weapons we create, it is the speed at which we may choose to use them. And when you combine rising tension with rapidly evolving tools of warfare, something else begins to happen. Something history has warned us about time and time again. Conflicts that once appeared contained, distant, even isolated, begin to stretch beyond their borders. They start to pull in attention, resources, and eventually involvement from others who were never part of the original dispute. Because no conflict today exists in isolation. Every region is connected, economically, politically, technologically. What happens in one part of the world sends signals across the entire system. And those signals don't just inform, they influence, they pressure, they provoke responses. A regional conflict might begin with a local grievance, territory, governance, identity, but very quickly it becomes something larger. Other nations begin to take interest, not always out of concern, but out of strategy. Alliances come into play, commitments are tested, and before long, what started as a localized issue becomes a stage for global positioning. You see, power doesn't just respond to conflict, it gravitates toward it, because conflict creates opportunity. Opportunity to expand influence, to secure resources, to demonstrate strength. And while that may serve short-term interests, it introduces long-term risk. Because the more actors involved, the more complex the situation becomes. And complexity, if not managed carefully, leads to unpredictability. Now think about the psychology behind this. When a nation sees its ally under pressure, there is an instinct to support, to defend, to stand firm. That instinct is rooted in loyalty, in shared interest, in credibility. Because if a commitment is not honored, trust begins to erode, not just between those two nations, but across the entire network of alliances. So leaders are not just making decisions based on the conflict itself. They are making decisions based on how those decisions will be perceived. Will inaction be seen as weakness? Will restraint be misunderstood as indifference? And in trying to manage perception, they may take steps that move them closer to direct involvement. This is how escalation often happens, not through a single dramatic decision, but through a series of smaller, seemingly justified actions, each one defensible on its own, each one rational within its context, but together they create momentum. And momentum, once established, is difficult to reverse. We've seen this pattern before. Moments in history where nations did not initially seek a large-scale war, but found themselves drawn into one because of obligations, miscalculations, and the inability to step back once the process had begun. The difference now is that the network is wider, the connections are tighter, and the pace is faster. There's also the role of economics in all of this. Global markets are deeply interconnected. Supply chains stretch across continents. Energy, food, technology, these are not confined within borders. So when conflict disrupts one region, the effects are felt everywhere. Prices shift, resources become scarce, stability begins to waver, and when economic pressure increases, so does political pressure. Governments are forced to respond, not just to external threats, but to internal demands. Citizens want security, they want stability, and when those are threatened, the call for decisive action grows louder. So now leaders are balancing multiple layers of responsibility: international commitments, domestic expectations, strategic interests. And in that balancing act, the margin for error becomes incredibly small. But perhaps the most important thing to understand is this: escalation is rarely intentional. It is often the result of misalignment, of goals, of communication, of perception. One nation acts to stabilize, another interprets it as aggression. One alliance strengthens its position, another sees it as encirclement. And just like that, the cycle intensifies. This is what makes the spread of conflict so dangerous. It doesn't require a master plan. It only requires a series of reactions that are not fully aligned. And in a world where information is incomplete and trust is fragile, that misalignment becomes more likely. So the responsibility here is not just to respond to conflict, but to understand its potential trajectory, to recognize early when a situation is no longer contained, to ask not just what is happening now, but what could this become if left unchecked? Because once a conflict reaches a certain scale, the options begin to narrow, flexibility decreases, positions harden, and the ability to de-escalate becomes more difficult with each passing step. This is why awareness matters. This is why perspective matters. Because if we only look at conflicts as isolated events, we miss the bigger picture. We fail to see the connections, the patterns, the warning signs that history has already shown us. And if we fail to see those patterns, we risk repeating them, not out of intention, but out of inattention. So as we consider the state of the world today, we must move beyond the idea that distance equals safety. In a connected world, there is no such thing as a distant conflict. There are only conflicts whose consequences have not yet reached us. And if we do not take seriously the way these situations expand, evolve, and entangle, then we may find ourselves asking how something so small became something so large, only after it is too late to contain it. And when we follow this path to its logical conclusion, rising tensions, accelerated technologies, and conflicts that refuse to stay contained, we are left with a question that is both simple and deeply uncomfortable. What does all of this mean for humanity? Because beyond strategy, beyond power, beyond politics, there are real human consequences, and those consequences are not abstract. They are lived. They are felt in homes, in communities, in the quiet moments where uncertainty replaces stability. War, especially on a global scale, does not just disrupt nations. It reshapes the human experience. Economies begin to fracture. Systems that once felt dependable start to strain under pressure. Access to basic needs, food, energy, healthcare, becomes less certain. And when those foundations begin to shake, the psychological impact is just as significant as the physical one. People begin to live differently. Fear becomes part of daily life, not always loud or visible, but present. It influences decisions, relationships, priorities. It narrows perspective. Because when survival becomes the focus, long-term thinking often fades into the background. And this is where the true cost of global conflict reveals itself, not just in destruction, but in limitation. The limitation of potential, the interruption of progress, the loss of opportunities that never get the chance to exist. Think about the generations that would grow up in such an environment. What kind of mindset are we cultivating when uncertainty becomes the norm? When trust in systems, in institutions, even in the future itself, begins to erode? Because stability is not just a political condition, it is a psychological one. It allows individuals to plan, to create, to invest in something beyond the present moment. When that stability is compromised, so is the ability to think expansively. And a world that cannot think beyond the immediate is a world that struggles to move forward. There is also the issue of displacement. Conflict forces people to leave behind what they know, their homes, their communities, their sense of identity. And while the term refugee is often used in policy discussions, behind that word are millions of individual stories. People navigating loss, uncertainty, and the challenge of starting over in environments that may not fully accept them. This creates strain not only on those directly affected, but on the global system as a whole. Resources are stretched. Tensions rise within and between societies, and the sense of division deepens. At the same time, global conflict has a way of distorting priorities. Resources that could be used for development, education, innovation are redirected toward defense and survival. And while security is essential, the imbalance can slow progress in areas that define the quality of human life. So we have to ask ourselves, what kind of future are we investing in when the majority of our energy is focused on protecting against each other rather than building with each other? Because ultimately, the stability of the world is not determined solely by the absence of war, but by the presence of cooperation, by the ability to resolve differences without destruction, by the willingness to see beyond immediate interests and recognize shared humanity. And this is where the conversation becomes more than political. It becomes philosophical. It challenges how we define strength. Is strength the ability to dominate, or is it the discipline to restrain? Is it found in control or in understanding? Because if we continue to approach global conflict from a mindset of competition alone, we reinforce the very dynamics that lead to escalation. But if we begin to shift toward a mindset of collaboration, of dialogue, of long-term thinking, we create space for different outcomes. Now, that shift is not easy. It requires trust in an environment where trust is fragile. It requires patience in a world that moves quickly. And it requires leadership that is willing to prioritize stability over short-term advantage. But it also requires something from us as individuals, as societies: awareness, engagement, a refusal to be passive observers of global dynamics that will ultimately shape our lives. Because the truth is, the impact of global conflict does not stop at borders. It reaches into economies, into cultures, into the very fabric of how we live and interact with one another. So the question is not whether we are affected. The question is how we choose to respond to that reality. Do we accept a future defined by fear and division, or do we actively support efforts, however small they may seem, that promote understanding, cooperation, and stability? Because history is not just shaped by leaders and events, it is shaped by collective mindset, by what people are willing to tolerate, to question, to change. And if there is one thing we must take from this entire discussion, it is this: the future is not something that simply happens to us. It is something we are participating in, whether consciously or not. So we have a choice: to remain reactive, waiting for outcomes we cannot control, or to become intentional, aware, and engaged in shaping a world where conflict is not the default path. Because in the end, the greatest threat to global stability is not just the presence of conflict, it is the absence of responsibility in how we respond to it.